Hello and welcome to this screencast video on literature reviews. My name's Kirsty, I'm an academic skills advisor with the Skills Centre at Sheffield Hallam, and in the next 20 minutes I'll be taking you through some top tips for planning and writing your literature review. So in this video we'll be considering the 3 key stages to writing any literature review, beginning with spending some time reflecting on the role of the literature review for your project. And we'll be looking at this both from the perspective of writing literature reviews as standalone assignments and how they might fit into a research project, for example, an undergraduate or postgraduate dissertation. We'll then move on to briefly consider the importance of developing a reading framework. So in other words, how can we adapt our reading strategies to make sure that we're being effective in our reading and that we're also taking notes on the kinds of content that will then be able to be built into our literature review in a critical way. Lastly, we'll look at a 3-tier model for literature reviews. This is a really useful structure that you can use in planning and writing your literature review. And one of the great things about this model is that it can be easily adapted for literature reviews of different types and different lengths. So whether you're writing perhaps a short literature review as part of a research proposal, or whether you're writing a long dissertation at postgraduate level where the literature review will go into several thousands of words. This 3-tier model will work for all kinds of literature reviews, so we'll spend some time focusing on that and thinking about the ways that you can apply it to your own work. To begin with, let's have a think about the function of literature reviews and the key purposes that that piece of writing might serve, regardless of the type of literature review that you're writing. So to begin with, all literature reviews should identify key themes, topics and relationships from your reading. And the aim here is to make sure that you're linking different sources from your reading together. In this way, it moves you away from just focusing on individual sources one by one and not recognizing the ways that they might fit together or even inform each other. So one key aspect of reading for the literature review is approaching your reading and the literature in a way that allows you to identify these key themes. So looking for shared topics, shared points of view, even shared methodologies or participants that allow you to acknowledge and recognize where is there a group of literature or where is there a group of articles that share a common feature. In doing this allows us to access the sort of second function of a literature review, and that is that in a literature review we should evaluate groups of literature. So once we've identified where there are these links and connections in our reading, we should then begin to critique and evaluate those pieces of reading, considering, for example, similarities and differences, their relative strengths and weaknesses, and also how approaching the literature in this way might help us to identify where there are gaps in the research. So for example, by collecting different sources together, you might start to build a map of your reading. You start to recognise where there are little groups or clusters of research. In doing that, you'll highlight where there are key similarities and differences between the papers within each cluster. But overall, you'll also get a really nice bird's eye view of your reading and start to recognise where there are gaps or where there are perhaps topics that have been overlooked or not researched in much detail. The final function of all literature reviews is to always link this literature back to your topic or your research question. So the function really is that while we group together literature, while we recognise there are these categories, we then kind of look at it through a selfish lens. So we're trying to show all the time how is our understanding of our topic or of our research area being informed by this connected approach to reading, and how can we really use and demonstrate how each of these groups is informing and giving us that insight. In addition to these 3 key functions of all literature reviews, there are also a few additional things to consider if you're writing a literature review as part of a research proposal or a dissertation. In these cases, your literature review should also spend some time focusing on the key theories and concepts that form the foundations of your research project. So when you look for those groups or those connections in the literature, spend some time looking at theoretical literature, maybe looking at particular concepts and models that you'll be able to then apply or adapt in your own project. So it's really important that the literature review in any kind of dissertation or research proposal introduces and evaluates the key theories and models that you'll be using in your own research. You should also aim to connect your research objectives to existing literature throughout the literature review. So when your marker or your dissertation supervisor reads through your literature review, they should recognise some of the key terms or the key concepts that you've mentioned in your research objectives. For example, in your research objectives, you may identify a particular subtopic, a context, or perhaps a group of participants that you're interested in researching. You should make sure that each of these aspects are dealt with and talked about in some detail in the literature review. This helps to demonstrate that your research objectives are always grounded in the literature and that you haven't designed objectives at random. Instead, they're always connected to and informed by existing research. We've already talked a little bit about this third point here, but really important in a research proposal or dissertation is that the literature review should aim to identify gaps in the research or problems that your dissertation project will then attempt to tackle or solve in some way. This is because the literature review is a really useful section for convincing the reader of the value of your project. We need to really demonstrate that that project is relevant and that it is connected to contemporary issues or contemporary problems in the literature. So think about this as well when reading. Can you start to identify where there are gaps? Or can you find central problems or debates in the literature that your dissertation will aim to tackle or make sense of in some way? So now that we've established the role of the literature review, we can move on to step 2 in the process, which is to think about how we can read effectively and adapt our reading strategies with the literature review in mind. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the focus of any of your reading for the literature review should be on how you can actively seek out links and connections either between individual sources or between the articles that you're reading and some of the key concepts and key texts that have been presented in lectures and seminars. One way to help you think about this is to think about the literature review as a map. And the process of reading and writing a literature review is like drawing a map, where you start to gather sources and different articles together into small clusters and groups. So your first point then is to sketch out on your map where are the towns and villages. In other words, where are the groups of sources that share some kind of common ground? They have that key similarity. As you then continue reading and start identifying more groups and more clusters of sources, you might then start to think about what connects these otherwise distinct villages and towns together. So thinking about the roads or the bridges that get you from one place to another on your map. For example, you could conduct your reading and start to think about different theories, and you could group together some literature based on theory A and another group of literature on theory B. We can then start to think about the ways in which theories A and B are connected. Perhaps it's that they share some key characteristics or that they're applied in the same contexts. Alternatively, it could be that actually on your map, those two theories are very far apart because they don't share many similarities and perhaps they actually oppose one another. Maybe there's a disagreement or a debate there. So the more that we read, the more we start to piece together this map, the more we add more houses, we add more villages, and we start to think about all the different ways in which these different groups are connected. Remember, when you're reading, you should also look out for gaps in the research. So as you draw your map, start to think about where are there areas that you can't populate? Where is there ground that you just don't seem to be able to fill? This suggests that that area has received limited attention from researchers. It could also be that though a topic is covered in the literature, it hasn't been covered from your topic or your perspective, perhaps not from your field or your area of practice. So think about the ways in which the literature exists, but it doesn't quite fit into your map. It's not quite as close to some of those groups of literature or to those towns as villages as you might like. Here are a few examples of how you might adapt that reading framework to suit your literature review. One strategy you could try is colour coding your notes. This will allow you to highlight some areas for comparison. For example, in every article or piece of literature that you read, you might use the same colour to highlight the theories that are being used. After you've read several articles, you could then go back, look for the highlights in that one colour and see if you can identify any connections or similarities across those different papers in the theories that are being used. This can be scaled up. You can use loads of different colours for different categories. The important thing is that you always review and reread your notes, seeking out those connections. Another strategy you might try is to use an appraisal grid, and if you search for this on Google, look for Hawker et al.'s paper from 2002. This appraisal grid allows you to break your articles down into key categories, and it uses a horizontal grid with different column headings so that you can break down every single article into its key structural elements, for example, the research aims, the sampling technique, the implications for practice, and so on. You can use those headings to guide your note-taking, and again, if you're able to use that appraisal grid consistently across different pieces of reading, you may start to recognise where those articles share similarities or where there are some interesting trends that you could discuss in your literature review. Finally, explore CASP tools and other appraisal tools that might be popular in your discipline. Although these tools for reading are generally associated with evaluating individual sources, they might still allow you to identify some similarities across your reading. So, for example, you may find that across several policy documents, there is the same recommendation for practice, or perhaps you feel they have the same weakness. Maybe a group of literature in your area is interesting, but all of those studies lack a large sample size. That weakness could itself be common to those different papers, and that could be the similarity that you choose to talk about in your literature review. There's a whole range of different strategies that you can use for looking for links between your articles. I think the important thing is to actively start doing this when you read. The more connections you can find, the more detailed and complex a literature review you can write. And really, you'll be fulfilling those key functions of a literature review if you can begin to map out the literature and identify key trends and categories. We're now ready to move on to step 3 of the process, which is the most interesting and in some ways the most exciting. And this is where we think about structuring your literature review. So the structure that we're going to look at in more detail in this video is a 3-tier model for literature reviews, where you separate that literature review into 3 key sections, which you can see here. The overall approach is to move from the broader context and become increasingly narrow or more focused as you move through that literature review. And that's why we've got this sort of upside down triangle. We're moving all the time from broad areas related to your topic of interest down to papers and articles that are much more closely related to some of the specifics of your study or of your research project. You'll notice that of these 3 sections, the top one is the skinniest. That dark green bar is not as large as the other 2. This is because although that first section is important, it shouldn't be where you include the majority of your studies. It should be there, it helps the reader understand your topic, it gives them context and overview, but your key opportunities to be critical will come in sections 2 and 3. So in terms of figuring out how to split up your word count, I would recommend using the bulk of your word count in parts 2 and 3 and keeping the section on context and overview reasonably short. One tip that I would recommend when using this structure is to use a lot of subheadings when you're structuring and drafting your work. Subheadings can help you organise each section by the topics or themes that you have identified in your reading. And by creating a subheading, it's a nice reminder of what it is that connects the literature in that paragraph together. You can then treat your literature review as a bit of a jigsaw because those sections then become kind of portable. You could take one section in its subheading and move it further up the literature review or further down, depending on where it fits in your broad to narrow structure. Towards the end of the process of writing the literature review, you can then make decisions about whether or not those subheadings are still necessary. For me, I would recommend writing with lots of subheadings to begin with, and then when you're ready to hand in this literature review or the dissertation, go back through and delete the subheadings that are no longer necessary. So let's look at what each of those sections should include in a little bit more detail. Section 1 should be where you introduce the studies that give context and overview. In other words, this section should serve as an introduction to your research area. There are a few different types of studies that you might want to include in this section. First of all, keep an eye out for any articles or pieces of literature that give good definitions of the key terms or concepts from your title. This helps demonstrate your understanding of the research area, and it also gets the reader on board with what you mean when you use a certain term. This is also particularly important and interesting if any of the key terms or ideas in your field are a point of disagreement amongst researchers. If that's the case, it can be useful in this section to use those different definitions to show that disagreement and to ultimately create your own definition that you will use for the purposes of your literature review. Secondly, look for literature that helps set the context for your study. And you should here aim to show why this is a relevant or important area for further research. What you're trying to do in this opening section of the literature review is convince the reader that this is a worthwhile dissertation or that this standalone literature review is a relevant study of the literature. In order to do this, you may want to look beyond academic literature. You may want to bring in sources like policy documents, grey literature, even media sources, for example, films, documentaries, blog posts, anything that can help you demonstrate and illustrate that this is an interesting area of study and it's a topic that lots of people are talking about. Lastly, this first section should also start to introduce the key theories or models in your research area. These are what the big names are using, or perhaps what some of the key trends from the last 5 years have been in your chosen area. For dissertations, you can make the decision whether or not to adopt or reject these in your own study. But it's important here to demonstrate that you have a good knowledge and a good understanding of what the majority of people are focusing on in your field. As you move through the literature review, you may choose to adopt and develop some of those theories in more detail, or you might choose to show the various ways in which your study rejects them. Regardless of your opinion, it's good to have them in this opening section, as it does again allow the reader to orientate themselves in your literature review, and it demonstrates that you have that good understanding of your field. The second section of the literature review is the one that is perhaps most tricky, and this is where you begin to bring in studies that are connected to the key themes, theories, and methods from your reading. Here, think about the literature and the sources that have informed and influenced your understanding of the subject, but there's something about them that holds them back. In other words, they aren't 100% relevant to, or they don't 100% match your project in every way. In this case, look out for articles that are in the same field, but they perhaps have a very different context. For example, they differ in their geographical location, perhaps their time frame, perhaps they focus on an entirely different set of participants or variable. In this way, they may still be influencing your understanding and offering some useful insight and information on the topic, but it will be difficult to really adapt and use these articles closely when you approach your own research topic. Think about as well, these could be studies that are linked to your area of interest in a general way, but they differ in how they are carried out. This is particularly true if you're conducting research or writing a literature review about an area of practice or professional work. You may find that there is lots of generic information out there, perhaps there are theories or models that are useful, but they haven't been looked at from the perspective of your professional role or from your practice. These would be good articles to include in the second section of the literature review. It's in the final section of the literature review that we get really zoomed in and we really start to hone in on the studies that are directly related to your topic or research question. Another way of thinking about this is that the authors or researchers that wrote these papers are your friends or your allies in the existing research, because it's their studies that are influencing your project in a number of ways. Here, you might want to bring in studies that you will actually replicate or directly respond to with your own research, perhaps a methodology that you will develop and take on in some way, or perhaps a theory that you kind of reject and don't agree with, and you want to write a companion piece or a response to that piece of theory. Also look out for studies that began with the same research questions or intents as your project. It's interesting to see how other researchers have taken a very similar area of research and perhaps the direction that they travelled in. You might be able to show that your project is directly related to those in some way or heavily influenced by them. Think about as well studies that match your project in more than one way. So if you imagine your project, if this is for a dissertation, or your assignment, there will be several features that you want to focus on. Perhaps you're interested in a certain topic and a context and a professional area of practice. It's in this last section of the literature review that the studies you use should match more than one of those components. So think of that as a checklist. Can you check off and tick that they match both the participants and the context of your area of study or of your research project? If that's the case, it's a good sign that those studies belong in this final section of the literature review, where studies are directly related to your own topic. Now, some people will get very lucky here. They will look to the literature and they'll find a number of studies that really closely fit their area of interest, or even that closely fit their dissertation topic. Others, however, might find it a bit more challenging. They may go to the research and find useful friends and allies, but nothing that really ticks multiple boxes, no studies that really closely fit in with their topic. That's absolutely fine. Here, we're aiming for the articles of best fit. We want to get as close as possible to your research area. But that may not always be possible. If not, think of this as improvising and bring in the articles that you'll perhaps borrow and cherry pick from other disciplines to help inform and develop your own topic and your own approach. And so, with that three-part model, you're ready to take your next steps in building and developing your own literature review. If you're in the early stages of the literature review, think about revisiting your topic or assessment criteria and drafting some research questions. Even at this stage, if you've got a particular topic or an area of interest, that's enough to help focus your literature search. What I would say is be prepared for those questions and that area of focus to change and develop as you write that literature review. Because the more you read, the more you build your knowledge, and you might come across some interesting connections in the literature that lead you towards another subtopic or a new area of research. That's absolutely fine. Don't treat those research questions as concrete things that you must stick to. They will change and evolve as you write the literature review, and that's completely normal. Secondly, if you've already started your literature review, I would say pause briefly and map an overview of the sources and the literature that you have so far. You can use that three-part model to organise what you've read into those three literature review sections, and this will allow you to get a good overview of some of the areas where you've got a lot of research and maybe some of the areas that you've been neglecting. As I mentioned earlier, parts 2 and 3 of the literature review are where you've got really good opportunities to be critical, so it's important to have literature to fit into those two sections. But also ensure that you do have a few articles that help you sketch out the key definitions of your terms, and that also help you provide context and really show why your topic is interesting and relevant to a new reader. Going forwards, also think about creating a plan for further reading. Again, you want to proactively look for those links and connections while you read. That might be by adopting something like Hawker's appraisal grid. You might be looking for something a little less complex, and maybe you're just happy to take notes and colour code in order to make connections. Whatever you can do to actively look for those links is always going to benefit your literature review in the long run. One top tip I can recommend is after reading each journal article, write a quick 3 bullet point summary of the key information that you've learned from that article. You might save this in a long Word document or write it by hand, but save all of your article summaries in the same place. Then have regular review points where you come back to that document, reread your summaries, and check for any links and connections there. This is a nice way of making sure that you're always tying your reading together, and you're unlikely then to forget what you've read or forget particular sources. If you're interested in learning more about literature reviews, there are some further resources mentioned here on this slide. First of all, we have a brilliant online guide from the Skills Centre to Literature Reviews, and that deals with both standalone assignments and dissertations. So if you're looking for more content on literature reviews, I can really recommend that online guide. If you're earlier on in the process of the literature review, the library also has a really useful step-by-step guide to literature searching. This gives you some ideas about search strategies and how to use the databases in library search. So if this is something of interest to you, you can find a link here on this slide, or do search in MyHallam for the literature searching guide. Lastly, I've included a link here to a book from Stella Cottrell, which is available as an ebook through the library. You'll find on page 157 a series of blank templates that you can use for note-taking. So if you are interested in using that appraisal grid approach, you can find some great examples available in this ebook. For more information and guidance on literature reviews, you can also attend one of our interactive online webinars. These sessions last 1 hour and they run throughout the year, including over the summer. If you're interested in attending a webinar on literature reviews, you can find all the details and available dates on our website if you follow the link from this slide here. In addition, when you're working independently at home, you might also find it useful to access our online resources, which again are signposted from our website. And just to mention, in addition, you can also access our one-to-one appointments. At the moment, while working remotely, these are available either as telephone appointments or using Collaborate for web chat, so we can use webcams and audio to have more of a face-to-face conversation. One-to-one appointments last 30 minutes and they're open to all students. They're a really good opportunity to discuss your work and get some pointers and strategies on how to develop it further. Literature reviews are a really popular topic that students bring along to these one-to-ones, and all of our advisors have got experience of working with students on this topic, so I can thoroughly recommend booking a one-to-one if you're looking for some more tailored guidance on literature reviews. As always, you can find all of the information on these sessions and our online resources on our website, and you can see the link to that here on this slide. Alternatively, if you have any questions whatsoever, no matter how small, feel free to drop us an email at skillscentre@shu.ac.uk. That's everything for this video. I hope this has been a useful introduction to literature reviews, and I wish you the very best of luck writing your future lit review.